Hey, how's it going? My name is Mark and this is Mark's Coding Projects. In today's video, we are going to be doing a bit more testing of the changes that we've made recently. For starters, we need a way to differentiate between our clients, but we also need that process. We'll call it. We need that process to be consistent. So what I mean by that is if you see in here, we've got IPs and port numbers relating to our clients. Well, we need the client IPs to be different. So the client 1 and client 2 need to have different IPs, etc. However, they need to be the same every time you run the code. So I'm only running 2 clients on my machine, and you'll notice every time we get a new port number. Now, what I want to do is I want to change that so that the port number remains the same every single time that specific client connects. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to change the constructor that we're calling to include our own IP that we're going to be using to communicate. And with that, we can also use a port number. So we're going to specify our own port number. You'll notice we've got this error message. That is because we need to wrap this in an INET get by name method. So this is just a wrapper. It will convert this string IP to an INET address. I'm not sure why. It's just how the socket class works in Java. So if you're wanting to ever do this kind of thing, you need to generate an INET address, not an IP. So this is an IP. This is a string IP, as is this, but this wrapped up then becomes an INET address. So you notice we've specified the port. This is a good first step. However, the slight problem with this is that every time we run this class, the port will be the same. So if I run 2 of this class at the same time, which is what I am doing, if you remember, this is the second client. It basically just runs a new instance of this class. When it does this, this class will be running. It will be running on this port. When this code is executed, it will then repeat all of these steps in here, and it will run on the same port, or rather it will try to. Because this isn't allowed, the second client won't be able to connect, and therefore will never be allowed to have 2 clients running at the same time. So the way to get around this is we're going to add something to the constructor, if I can spell. There we go, call it port. I'm then going to pass port in here. So all this means is that every time we create a new instance of this class, we need to specify the port number. So what was it, 50907, I think. So that's one port number. Here we'll do 50908. This could completely break my computer, by the way, if I disrupt some sort of major process. We'll have to see. Basically, we now have 2 clients set up, each with a unique port number that will remain consistent no matter how many times we connect to the server. Okay, so if I clear this text file, and I'll demonstrate what I mean. Okay, so everything is up and running, server's up, 2 clients are up, and these ports match the port numbers that we specified in our class. Now I'm just going to run it again, and then I'll show you the contents of our connections text file. Sorry, I'm saying the connections match, the port number matches what we specified. So if I run this again, well, in theory, if I run this again, it should ask me if I want to continue a previously saved game when we connect a second client. So we'll see what happens. Okay, and fantastic, it does. So I'm going to put yes, and it broke. So player 1 can continue, player 2 can't. Okay. So this is the first error that we have encountered. However, it does demonstrate that some of the code is working. So the matching of opponents, so presumably our the section of our code in our write connections method where it scans the file for your opponent's IP address, that is working, which is good news. The bit that isn't working is then presumably we're receiving an input that we shouldn't be receiving. That'll be my guess. But we can look into that. Okay, so I've been having a look at the error we received. So our program asks us if we would like to continue the game. If we answer yes, presumably we'll then receive input from the user. Problem with that is that this input will be received here. So the response of you have a saved game or whatever, which we'll be sending from the server, is then going to be picked up by our statement here, which is going to be pulling in the counter variable. And so yeah, it's not the right point at which the input needs to be coming in. So we need another input statement, which only works if you're player 2, which I'm not sure how we're going to achieve that. Okay, so first off, if the input is being sent to this class, the same class that is getting is being asked if it would like to continue a saved game, that means that the input is directed to the wrong client. So yeah, so here this socket needs to be changed to s connections dot get x dot get socket. So yeah, cool. Okay, so what that means is that we are asking our opponent if they would like to play a game, not ourselves. So I'm going to rerun. I'm going to see what that does, and then we may or may not have to make some more improvements. Okay, so it's found our game in the text file, which is true. You know, we've connected before, the server hasn't gone down. Oh no, tell a lie, the server has gone down because we switched the whole thing off. So the server's gone down, we've connected multiple times. That information has been retained in the text file despite the fact that the server has gone down, which is good. If I then say yes, nothing happens. Awesome. Okay. Interesting. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So if I switch over, what happens if I say yes to this? Nothing. Cool. The server. Okay, so the server's waiting for input. This application is now frozen, as has this one. So interesting. Okay. We'll do some further investigation. Presumably, what the problem is that if we respond with yes, where is this input coming from? Oh, okay, presumably the input is coming from here. That would be my guess, which is, I think that's fine. I've put a print statement into the bottom of this, the bottom of the server. So in our opponent response method, I've printed out what answer is. Now, that doesn't seem to be working. So if we go up to the top, our opponent response is being triggered because this data is being received by our client. So our second client is being asked, okay, do you want to connect to Uni? You got a game request. Do you want to connect? Yes or no? That information is now going to the correct client, which is good. It's being sent correctly. So that means that we are triggering the opponent response. Within our opponent response, we then generate a string called answer. We then use our output to client method, which takes the socket and the question that we've asked the user and says, okay, you've got a game, would you like to play? That's the point at which we actually communicate with the client. We then wait for a response from the client. However, for some reason, this doesn't seem to be being triggered. So I wonder if I put a statement in here, will it print out? I'm assuming it will. Print line, and then I'll run this. Okay, so yes, we would like to continue. Yes, nothing. Connected to client. Okay, cool. So it's the input from client that's failing. Okay, so if we go into input to client, we have string response, the connection failed. We then have our input stream, which reads, our input is fairly standard. So it would seem to me that our client class isn't sending a response to our server, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Because oh, okay, I understand. I see what's going on. Okay, so yeah, we aren't sending the correct information back, or rather, we're not sending any information back at all. And that is because response equals it equals the string that we send in opponent response. So response is equal to this. Okay, so it says you have a new game request, would you like to accept? So that's response. So this if statement is ignored. We then have both clients waiting to be assigned counter values. However, we have a server waiting for input here. So it's waiting here, and in our client classes, we are waiting here. Both are waiting for input and no one receiving any output. So what are we going to do about that? What needs to be done is we need to think if I drop this, there we go. If I then change, if I change this information here, yeah, so if I change this whole question to a yes, there we go. And then it will basically, if you have a saved game in the text file, it will ask you, do you want to continue your saved game? If your opponent sends you a game request, it will also ask you, do you want to continue your saved game? And then presumably, if the server doesn't find anything, then both of them will receive no as an input, and this will carry on as normal. Fingers crossed. So let's test it. It's interesting because you'll notice that it seems to be saying that it's getting to board to array, and it isn't hanging on our input method, which is really bizarre. Yeah, so weirdly, it just seems to be skipping this, which I really don't understand. I suppose we could try printing response. Okay, so we're getting a response. That's good. So who is it that's being disconnected? It's client 2. So this first client that's connected, that's being disconnected. Interesting. Okay. I still don't understand why answer isn't being printed to the console though. That is something I don't quite understand. Because output, so, sorry, in our input from client, we are able to print out our response. Presumably, we're then able to return that value. And by doing so, it should be here. The next line that should then be executed is here. Input from client is triggered. The response is received, but that's from the first client. Opponent response is then triggered here, and we don't get a second yes. So why aren't we receiving a second input? That's really odd. Okay, so I'm going to take it slower, and every time I do something, I'm going to look at the server. So all of this is normal because this connection hasn't yet been accepted. So we need to establish whether it's going to accept its opponent or not. When it does that, what does this do? Oh, interesting. Okay. It's really bizarre because I would have thought that this setup here, it would match this here. I would have thought those two would have been identical. For some reason, they're not. I don't quite understand why. So one thing I do want to test is whether or not it will accept no. So if you don't want to continue playing with your opponent, what happens? So it kind of works. It's just there's an extra input being sent which doesn't need to be sent. Okay, so we found an error when we type no. I think the reason for that is because if we type no, we then send more data to the client, which it doesn't need, because if we type in no, we're no longer waiting for any input up here or anything like that. We're waiting for our counter. So I think that that line can be ignored. So I'm going to run it again and see what happens. Great. Okay, so no is now working. Okay, so I've been sat here for about half an hour now trying to figure out what the problem is, and I've got my head around it. So in the server class, what I hadn't really, well, no, I knew, but I didn't realize it was going to be an issue. So if you'll remember, we had a thread starting here. Now, this is part of our save connection method, and this bottom if statement is what happens if you are the first connection to the server. So if there's no one, or just if you're someone who doesn't match any opponent in the text file, and there's an even number of opponents at the time of you joining, so there's no one available for you to connect to. So it will check that you don't have an opponent who's connected to the server, and then it will also check that you can't connect to anyone who's already connected. If you don't meet either of those categories, you end up in here. Now, the problem with having this thread starting is the fact that when we start the thread, we immediately expect input. So when we got this board to array issue, I probably should have noticed this. The board to array issue was in our connection container class. So it was the input method here that was receiving the yes or no response that we were sending from the client. And obviously, yes or no doesn't correlate to a board. As a result, it was crashing. So what I've done to rectify this, if we go down to update connection, it's only when your game is matched up, so when you're paired up with someone, that the first client's thread is executed. And what that means is if we go up to where update connection is triggered, update connection is triggered once we get the response from our opponent as to whether or not they want to connect. So you need to see it. Update connection is only triggered once this input comes through from our opponent. So, opponent response and input from client and all of that. So all of that input and output is dealt with before we actually start running either of the threads, i.e. before we start anticipating any sort of board that we will be receiving from the client. And it works. So I'll give you guys a quick demo now. Okay, I'll give you a few scenarios. So no, I don't want to start my previously saved game. And there we go, working fine. Player 2. Yeah, happy, and they're communicating fine. You also notice that there's no console line being written anymore when player 1 is connected. So the first console line that is being written is when player 2 is connected. So this port number matches the first input. So what that means is that this isn't the server isn't expecting any input or output from client 1 until an opponent joins, which is quite useful, because the job of this until it's matched up is just to sit there. Like, there's no point. I did think it'd be more efficient putting it in its own thread, but since it isn't actually doing anything, it's literally just idle. It probably doesn't make much of a difference whether it sits on the server or in a connection container object. So what happens when we say yes? When we say yes, it should work. So there we go, let's do a redo. Cool, everything's up, and yes. And then there we go. So we're not having the previous error. This is now working. He's waiting. She's requesting a move. And the server is fine. So yeah, there we go. And I can play a game. This will need to be tested further. If everything works properly, I won't make a video on it because I feel like I've done an awful lot of testing and not actually done much improvement on the code. So I will check to make sure that lowercase letters work, and that if one user types yes and the other types no, so player 2 types in yes, and then player 1 says, actually no, I don't want to continue that saved game, is that acceptable? All of that I'm going to be testing off camera, and if any of it doesn't work, then I'll debug it with you guys. But if it all works, just assume, you won't see a video on it, so just assume that it's all fine. Ha, I got you. I bet you all thought that the tutorial was over. Think again. No, my solution was not perfect. So I'm recording this a few days after the end of this video. This issue persisted for a long time. So what I found was the solution worked for yes and yes and no, but it didn't work for yes and no. I've now found a solution that works for all three. So you'll notice we've got rid of this. Where is this? Our save connection, I think. We have this else statement which triggers our output, but we've got rid of the boolean now. We've removed the output from this if statement entirely, because one thing I did realise is that if we put output in here, there's a chance that it triggers multiple times due to the for loop, and so that can cause issues. On my client side, I don't really think anything's changed, to be honest. Yeah, this has just remained the same. It was just I've moved the output to an else statement up here, and yeah, got rid of the boolean. So this is now a working solution for yes and no on both the client and your opponent. This full working code is now available on GitHub. If you've enjoyed the video, I know these testing videos have been a bit of a drag, but don't worry, the next one's going to be, we're going to be building some new stuff, which I'm quite excited about. So I hope you've all enjoyed. Please do like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial.